Hello, my name is Dr. Christian Reynolds. I'm a reader at the Centre for Food Policy, and tonight I am your host. And tonight we will be presenting a talk. And the Centre for Food Policy does lots of different webinars and talks, usually the Food Thinkers presentations. And this is an extraordinary presentation, mainly because Jeremy is over from Australia. And so we thought it would be a great occasion. That is to say, we have a Food Thinkers seminar coming up very shortly, and I'll tell you about that in a few minutes' time. So again, the Centre for Food Policy typically brings together talks and has big ideas in academia, policy, business, advocacy, and practice on how we redesign food systems. And again, this is an extraordinary meeting tonight, but it will definitely be in the same vein. And so tonight we have Dr. Jeremy Farr. But first, let's do some housekeeping while hopefully some more people come into the room and also people online. So firstly, this webinar is being recorded and the question and answer session afterward will be recorded. They will be put on our YouTube channel, which is the Centre for Food Policy. If you search for it, I'll put it into the chat afterwards. But it now has about 10 years worth of Food Thinkers webinars. So it's an amazing resource of podcast webinars for you to go back and engage with. Online and also in person, if you want to go join the Zoom meeting, you're more than welcome. Put the questions into the Q&A box rather than the chat directly, so we can triage and make sure we work through the questions. If you aren't putting a question in online, the Q&A box, not the chat box. In the chat, please do put who you are and where you're from, because that way we can say hello to all of you in the kind of break and those sorts of things. So it'd be lovely to say where you're from, your LinkedIn posts and social media handles into the chat, but please do put just questions in the Q&A box so we can answer them. We'll try to respond to as many of these as possible. In the room, please raise your hand. We have microphones in the room for turn those on to be live mics once the Q&A section begins. So all the discussion will be able to be heard both online and in person. Now, next month, we have a really exciting thing. Well, this month, the 22nd of October, I should say, we have Dr. Charlotte Bitlitoff, who is giving a talk on the processed food and the politics of communication from the University of California, Davis. So Wednesday, 22nd of October, the tickets are now live. It's an online only event. Again, it's going to be really, really exciting to see her views, and definitely in the Centre for Food Policy, a few of us have read her book and we're really excited about her different findings on how processed food has been communicated. If you'd like to hear more about these different Centre for Food Policy events, including the Food Thinkers webinars, these extraordinary webinars, other things like that, please do sign up to our mailing list. I'll put that into the chat as well. And finally, applications to join our MSc in Food Policy this January. So we've started our September autumn cohort, but our MSc Food Policy for January intake is open. Likewise, we also have our professional development course, Political Economy of Food, starting in January. So both come and learn with me about political economy of food, as well as come and learn the entire MSc in Food Policy. These are available both in person here in Clerkenwell in London, as well as online courses available to you. So it'll be lovely to see you if you're interested in those. Do let them know. So now I'm going to put the links into the chat. I can already see there's quite a few people who've been giving their social media things and handles into the chat, which is amazing. Next, I'm going to just introduce Jeremy. So Dr. Jeremy Farr is currently a postdoctoral research fellow investigating the enablers and barriers to food system transformation in Australia and beyond. His work explores critical questions such as what future food systems should look like, how can we achieve that vision, and how do we navigate the complex challenges along the way. So for the next 40 minutes or so, I present Dr. Jeremy Farr. Woo, go Jeremy!
Oh, there we go. Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me here in person and online. I want to thank Christian for organising this talk really ad hoc. I reached out in maybe end of August to say I was coming to London and whether I could have a quick chat. And then I found that apparently a lot of people were signing me up to do this talk, and then a lot of people were signing up to attend it. So that's really fantastic and really exciting. And it's really great to be able to communicate my ideas to a different audience. So I'll just quickly just give 2 words about my background. So I am a interdisciplinary researcher. My background was actually in environmental archaeology and anthropology. I also have an MSc in environmental sustainability. So I've had a very meandering career, which has meant that I guess that's kind of helped me think about things in a systems way, because as you learn about different things, you start to see the threads that connect them together. So I'll leave it there and I'll just say, so today I'm going to talk about ways of seeing food systems policy, challenges, paradigms, and tools. Now, something we do in Australia, which I'm going to do quickly here, is we give, if I can get this to function, an acknowledgement of country. Now, obviously, we're not actually on the land at the moment, but this is the land where I do my work. So I want to pay my acknowledgements to the Turrbal and Jagera people as the traditional owners of the land upon which I work, and on which I conduct my research, and pay my respect to their elders, past and present. So today, I'm going to try. This is quite it's a complex topic, and I want to cover lots of different things. So I've broken it up into 4 parts. So hopefully it will make sense as we go through. I'm hoping it turns into a story. I did finish this in Gales about 2 hours ago, so hopefully it's not terrible. But it has actually been a work in progress over a couple of years, so some of it should make sense. And obviously, you can absolutely kill me in the questions afterwards if it doesn't. So first of all, I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to give a kind of introduction to what are food systems and why do they need to change. And I'm going to introduce this word of posywid, which is the purpose of a system is what it does, and we'll get into that. Part 2, we'll talk about the challenges and barriers for effective policy making in food systems. So we're just going to cover some of those issues, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. Maybe some of them you won't, but I'm sure they're pretty common. Then we'll talk about policy paradigms as a way of seeing food systems policy. So this is going to focus. This section will actually be based on a piece of work that I've been doing for my postdoc. So I'll kind of walk you through a couple of the steps of what I've actually been doing. And it'll be quite interesting to see what you make of it and whether it's helpful as a way into the topic and whether it makes sense. And then finally, I'm going to talk about some tools that will hopefully enable us, kind of enable ways of seeing food systems and policy interactions. And these will be the sort of tools that I'm proposing may help policymakers in the work they do, but also help us as researchers to help make sense of policy and food system interactions, so that we can actually communicate our science better and actually understand this wicked problem of food systems. So, all right, part 1. So what are food systems and why do they need to change? So this really interesting guy here, who kind of, he's got this kind of Fagin-esque look about him, is Stafford Beer, which is also a fantastic name. And he was he's a very prominent systems theorist. And he came up with this heuristic, which is the purpose of a system is what it does. And the idea of this is that there is no point in claiming that the purpose of a system is to do what it constantly fails to do. So if any of you have thought about how food systems are functioning and our grand ambitions for food systems, this, I think, is a very useful phrase to help us enter into this topic. You can actually start to think, well, what is going on and what is the food system trying to do? What's it for? So when we talk about food systems, we can say this is a diagram that I pulled together, which is kind of roughly based on one made by, I believe, Van Berkom, the kind of Wageningen model. It's meant to demonstrate all the activities, drivers, and outcomes relating to food. It also is meant to illustrate the dynamics between these elements and related subsystems. The important aspect of this is that it's not a linear system. Often when people talk about food systems, we kind of get some reductionist talk about supply chains and value chains. Now, don't get me wrong, supply chains and value chains are important parts of the food system. They're important to analyze. But when we're talking about food system, at least as far as I'm concerned, we're talking about these wider dynamics. And what I like to refer to is more about thinking about food systems like you would think about ecology. So you're thinking about this big system with lots of moving parts, lots of elements, biotic and abiotic, which are interacting all the time, exchanging energy, exchanging flows, exchanging information, and this helps us on our way in. And obviously, our main concerns as scholars of food systems usually kind of focus on the outcomes, which are health, society, economic outcomes, and the environment. And obviously, there are lots of different things which will drive kind of these dynamics within this. So hopefully that's a primer for any of you, but I'm sure this is all old news for many in attendance. So in terms of making this argument for change, you know, people say, well, actually, you know, we can all go to the supermarket. Tesco's is there. If you're in Australia, Coles is there. Most of us can access food. Most of us look very healthy in this room. Sorry, all of you, all great. But we can actually point to lots of issues in the food system to say, well, maybe it's not quite working the way we need it to, especially with some of the crises which are actually not even just on the horizon, but are now here, you know, causing a lot of problems for us. So we can say that agriculture currently contributes to around 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, there are some debates about that. Some people put it at 18%. Some people say it's up to 1/3. The point is, this is a major contribution, and it's the single largest contribution to greenhouse gas emissions that is directly linked to human activity. So it's something we actually have a lot of control over. And so besides this, industrial agriculture alongside climate change has had a devastating impact on biodiversity. So we've got two diagrams here, which, sorry, this is getting in the way, isn't it? I'll just move that out of the way. So we've got two diagrams here which show these, you know, one showing the proximate drivers of biodiversity loss, and these barcode lines you might have seen before. One, the bottom one shows kind of global warming over time, and the top one shows the impact on global biodiversity. So if you refer back to this left-hand diagram, you'll see that like this is the impact of human behaviour on biodiversity loss is immense. So we also have the concentration of industrialized agriculture, which has impacted regional development across the world. Now, a really good person to look into here is Jennifer Clapp, if you're not familiar. She's written widely on this and has, I think, just published a new book, which is really exciting. And so there's a nice kind of fact here about small farms make up 72% of all farms. They occupy just 8% of all agricultural land. In contrast, large farms, which account for only 1% of the world's farms, occupy 65% of agricultural land. So what you're talking about is a highly concentrated ownership of land, which obviously has massive implications for who controls the food system, food sovereignty, and obviously inequality. And then we can kind of turn to some of the kind of social impacts of food systems as they exist now. So again, we're still sort of just talking through this argument for transformation. So actually, you know, the purpose of the system is what it does. How we, you know, why do we need to address this topic anyway? Well, actually, we can say that nutritional quality and the diversity of foods have declined in recent decades, and that's you can kind of link that to the previous point about the concentration of ownership. The current political economy of food means that actually there's been a massive reduction in the types of species of plants being grown. That's moved us towards a monoculture, and that's actually had quite a few detrimental effects in terms of health outcomes and also, you know, nutrition outcomes. But also, even despite this, these economies of scale that have been created through these kind of monoculture systems, food insecurity and food-related diseases have increased. And what I've tried to show here, this is a kind of slide I used in a presentation some time ago, was that food bank use both in the UK and Australia, these are both high-income countries, have increased. So it's not like maybe 20 years ago when people used to talk about food security as a global south problem. It used to be defined in terms of a development issue, and you know, that was how we needed to treat the problem. Now everyone is, in all countries, are feeling an impact. So we can kind of move away from this idea that it's an over there problem, which I think obviously was the way that it was viewed occasionally in the 90s and early 2000s. So moving on to part two, we're going to talk about, so now we're going to kind of get into the talk proper and talk about some of the challenges and barriers for effective policy making in food systems. So why is seeing food systems hard? So I'm sure you've seen this before. This is probably a staple of a lot of early lectures. That's right. For those not in the room, Christian was just giving a salute. But it's that the elephant, if lots of blindfolded people touch different parts of an elephant, they're going to think it's a different thing. And so we can say that food systems are really complicated. They're really hard to scope. What do you include in the food system? I mean, the food system can basically expand to the absolute extent of the universe, or it can be as narrow as what you do in this building, depending on what you want it to be, depending on what you want to talk about. There are also multiple perspectives and interpretations of food systems, as you can imagine. There are, in terms of institutions and governments especially, you can have, and even just research institutes, you can have silos. There's a lack of coordination, and we can talk about policy coherence, which I'm going to talk more about in coming slides. I mean, that can absolutely happen just even at the academic level, where you've got multiple disciplines studying food systems from completely different perspectives, not always talking to each other, not always reading each other's work. And so that means that we're potentially missing certain linkages which could really give us some insights. We also have competing priorities for what matters. I guess this goes back to multiple perspectives. Some people may really be focused on the economics of the food system, and for them actually the food system is just profits and how much money we're making. Other people are only concerned with the environment. Some people will be more concerned with justice. Some people will be more concerned with health. Certainly I found out recently through a study on social media, doing an analysis of perceptions of healthiness of milks on TikTok, that health is seems to be the major driver among people who use TikTok, at least. So it's very interesting that there's such a focus on health, but actually not much focus on other things. And then the other thing is that the connections within food systems can be fuzzy or overdetermined. So when I say overdetermined, what that means is there might be lots of different factors that could lead to the same result, no matter what you do. So it could be that you say, oh, well, here's how X influences Y, but it might be that X, A, B, and C also all will lead to Y anyway. So it makes it very hard to understand whether what you're seeing is a true connection, or whether it's just a coincidence, or whether it makes a difference if that's where your intervention lies. So one of the major challenges for lots of policymakers and also us as researchers is the fragmented governance of food systems. So as I was referring to earlier, food systems can be everything. Food system touches so many different parts of life. I mean, food systems are the sort of bedrock of societies as they exist. We rely on them for everything else, and so actually, you can't avoid this. This is not there's not some sort of magic thing which will allow you to capture all the things related to food systems and put them in one department. There's probably a few things you could do to put them in a more focused area, but lots of things will necessarily need to be distributed. So this is actually a diagram from a report published earlier this year, which I authored with Kelly Parsons, formerly of this parish, who about the distribution of responsibilities across the Australian federal government. And this doesn't even include what would happen at state level, what would happen at local level. So you can see that there's so many people, so many stakeholders involved in food systems. That's obviously going to make it quite difficult to address any single challenge easily. So on top of that, coordination between departments can be very varied. So sometimes you get departments who will work on a specific issue quite closely, and we'll talk about this more in a bit. sometimes departments don't talk to each other at all. And in fact, they can be working absolutely in opposite directions of each other. And that means that obviously you don't quite get the results you want, or you can accidentally undermine what you're trying to achieve. And with that, you can see how departments might view things differently. And we're going to get into this when I start to talk about paradigms, is that actually different departments can have their own cultures. They can have their own KPIs. So that also is going to shape how we can, it also kind of increases this kind of idea of fragmentation when that's the case. And we'll talk about how to deal with that again later. So another issue that I'm going to or another challenge, I should say, that governments face are top-down perspectives. Let me move this out of the way slightly because it is, there we go. So, it made me think about this idea of seeing like a state. Now, here's a report published by ABARES in 2023 based on COVID-19. And they were writing it in response to how the pandemic affected food systems. And what they've said is Australia does not have a food security problem. And they've put these beautiful stats, which really show that, in many ways, Australia, it produces enough food for about 70 to 75 million people. So we have a country of 25 million. So there should be no issue in terms of food availability. And it's a high earning country. People have, food is relatively affordable. But the problem is that these statistics, this is an accurate statement based on the framing that they've used, which are top-down statistics. So it's not incorrect in a way, but it might actually be the result of being slightly blinkered from this top-down perspective. There's only so many things we can see. And so, oops, sorry, I've gone backwards. We can compare this with other forms of evidence for action. The Food Bank Australia talked about how, I think this is from 2024, that 5 million, they said that 5 million Australians have experienced food insecurity in the last 12 months, and that they had provided relief to 815,000 Australians every month. So we can see from work on the ground that there is obviously some people who are at least experiencing food stress. This starts to raise issues of how we're using definitions. Are we saying that people are food insecure? Are we saying food stress? These things, these things have to be decided. But certainly it certainly doesn't paint the kind of rosy picture of that everything's fine, and it should be something that should be addressed. A brilliant piece of work by Chandana Mitra, who's from the University of Sydney, explored a Hilda survey from a couple of years ago based in Australia, looking at evidence of food insecurity. And I put some bullet points here of what she found. So using Australia-specific thresholds on the national scale, 1 in 11 people were food insecure. Severe food insecurity is a concern in Australia. South Australia and Queensland are the most food insecure states. Certain subpopulations, such as lone persons, are at higher risk of food insecurity, and household level measures of food insecurity may hide intra-household food hardship. So we can see again, it's very difficult to see food insecurity. There's lots of ways in which you may or may not see it, depending on how you count it, how you explore it, how you define it. And then there are some people who are very, very invisibilized, and that's often the Aboriginal community in Australia. And so there's been some really, really interesting research, and I've just put one up here as an example by Sheriff et al., which was looking at perspectives on food insecurity in urban and regional in Australia. And so there's a number of really, really good studies done. But what's interesting is that the studies of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders tend to be qualitative studies rather than these positivist studies. And that's quite interesting. So we can find all of this new information by doing this on-the-ground research, talking to people, running workshops, gaining perspectives. And that helps us think about maybe how we might need to redefine how we look at things, how we're capturing data, how we can check ourselves. So we'll carry on going because I'll come back to that. So I just want to move on. So we're going to return to that in a bit. I want to move on to this idea of policy paradigms as a way of seeing, or as I like to think about it, how to get unstuck, because that's how I arrived at the topic. So I'm just going to quickly give an introduction to paradigms. And I just want to acknowledge Kelly Parsons, who I stole these images from one of her slides, just the 2 images. I wrote the text myself, I promise. So paradigms are the values, motivations, and objectives that underpin practices or policies and the economic, social, and environmental conditions that shape them. So I mean, in a word, you could say the context, in a way. So it's the context, but the context in terms of a kind of social context. But it could be other things too. And this kind of, I want to kind of draw you back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of how different institutions, different departments can have different cultures. So policy paradigms was coined by Peter Hall in 1993, who was a researcher on kind of policy theory and historical institutionalism. And he had based it in turn on work by Thomas Kuhn, who was looking at the structure of scientific revolutions. So what policy paradigms allow us to do is look at these factors that act as enablers and barriers for seeing issues in the food system and the values that determine what constitutes a legitimate or viable solution. Another phrase for this, which you may have heard of, is the Overton window, which is the idea of what can exist. What are possible ideas that can enter the public space or the academic space? What can you even conceive of? That's one way of thinking about it. But it might also be, say, defined by what's appropriate for your workplace. You might have an idea that you could have in the academy that you can't have working for the government, and vice versa. So these things can also explain the circumstances under which paradigm shifts do or do not occur, based on this notion of crisis, which was defined, which was what the word that Kuhn used in his structure of scientific revolutions, and the idea of punctuated equilibriums. So to put punctuated equilibriums briefly, it's this idea that rather than always moving in this kind of gradual evolutionary state, what you have is a kind of broadly a singular state, and then a crisis will emerge that forces an entire rethink of a situation, and that then you move to a new state quite rapidly. So you can think, and COVID-19 is quite an interesting example of where we existed in one state before, and then during COVID-19, a lot of things changed very rapidly and people were working in very different ways. And interestingly, we've kind of reverted after that. So in terms of my work, and this is what I'm going to start getting into now, I was quite interested in conceptualizing agricultural policy paradigms for state level comparisons. So what I wanted to do was take a bunch of high income countries and think about how are they different, how do they converge and how do they diverge in terms of their approach to food production systems. And there are kind of broadly 4 main paradigms that exist. So we've got free trade, exceptionalism, and exceptionalism is really where the farming sector is treated differently from other sectors. So for example, in a free trade country where you have fairly liberal economics, exceptionalism is where you treat farming systems with social supports. So you'd say they're actually quite different. They sit apart as an exception from the prevailing economic approach or the prevailing economic paradigm. Productivism, which is the intensification of production, very yield focused, the idea of making as much as you can. And then multifunctionalism, which is promoting a mix of outcomes, which could be anything from regional development, social outcomes, sustainability, landscape conservation. The important aspect of multifunctionalism is that it's versus productivism, you're giving different values, additional values to production on farmland, if that makes sense. So you can ask me more about that later. So what I did to kind of do this comparison was I mapped major policy developments for 6 case study countries over about 200 years. I made a qualitative assessment of agricultural policy paradigms and their change over time, analysed time series data of certain metrics to look at how these paradigms shape performance, and then I analysed existing policy from the different countries and emerging statements from international fora relating to green finance. Basically, what I was trying to do was see where things had come from and now see where they're going. And so I picked these 6 countries, and what they have in common is market-based economies. They're all members of their OECD. They all advocate free trade as a principle of sustainable development, but they also have fairly divergent agricultural policies and objectives. So they've made good case studies to look at. So here's my crazy diagram that I made, which maps the history of policies from about 1846 onwards. So I started with the repeal of the Corn Laws, which had a massive effect on global trade. And then I traced this evolution over time of different policies. So I'm just mapping the policies. And what I've also tried to do is think about major events. So, Irish famine, US Civil War, the 2 world wars, the Great Depression, oil crisis, and as well, different changes in technologies, which also have quite a significant effect in terms of their how approaches to farming and farming policy have been done. That these are disruptions that reshape or can shape, massively influence political economy. So I wanted to bring it all together so I could start to think about it. And alongside this, what I was doing was I started to see how actually there is actually a way of, rather than thinking about these as 4 different paradigms, you can actually think about them as a quadrant. So you can actually think about them in a way where different states shift over time in terms of their policy, where you can be free market and be productivist, and that's kind of represented by the Cairns Group, who are, countries like Australia, very productivist countries with a liberal market view. You can have free market and multifunctionality. Again, you can see that in places in Australia, places like the Sunshine Coast, where there's a lot of protection for nature. There's lots of values in the way that people are producing things, and it's still just with the market. It's not being supported by any states. You can have multifunctional exceptionalism. I think that's the most common form of multifunctionality that exists. So it's things like CAP, where it's being state supported or at least subsidized, and you can have exceptionalist productivism, which is pretty much what all states were doing with mercantilism. So it's the idea of producing as much as you can with state support where necessary, tariffs, things like that. And so this is how I kind of mapped it over time. So you see this kind of evolution of where different countries sat based on their policies. And you can sort of see that there are kind of quite significant shifts from like mercantilism onwards, and that where they sit now, Australia sits really within a kind of free market productivist paradigm, but it's been becoming more multifunctional with its current policies. The EU, I mean, this is a qualitative assessment, but the EU, I think, kind of sits in the middle, and former EU with Britain, in terms of having this balance between productivism and multifunctionality. That's not a value judgment, by the way. It's just more of how the policies play out. And Norway, which has a very, very kind of exceptionalist and multifunctional approach to policy. And what was interesting comparing all of these things was that actually, despite these quite different approaches across these 6 countries, total factor productivity is basically the same. And that actually, in terms of things like number of farms, actually there's not a massive difference, or it's hard to tell if there's actually any major difference in terms of the loss of farming, which means we just have to look at different factors. So there's some interesting things there about how, despite these adopting different approaches and there being different logics, different paradigms at play, ultimately we kind of land in the same place. So I'm not really sure what to make of that. I'm still trying to work that out. But what we're dealing with now is this call for new paradigms. So we can say from the UN Food System Summit, the Sustainable Development Goals, and COP28 and COP29, that there's a massive call for multifunctionality. That is, that we need to start protecting biodiversity, that we need to start thinking about local communities, that we need to think about all these social systems. So we need to be thinking about more about equity. And you can see some of this playing through ESG. There's some things with de-risking programs to help support food security. So I think I originally wrote this obviously over a year ago. Carbon market schemes and biodiversity certification. So this is where there's a kind of broad agreement that we need more multifunctionality, despite having very different kind of paradigmatic approaches, which is quite interesting. So now I'm going to move on to the final part of my talk, and I won't stretch it out too long. I'll try and keep this within 10 minutes, which is the tools that enable ways of seeing system interactions, policy interactions, and underlying value systems. So one tool we can use, these are mechanisms for connecting food policy. These were also published in the same report that I referenced earlier, that came out with CSIRO, I think maybe in May. And that these are all sorts of methods that could help different government departments connect together and create stronger coordination across different portfolios. So you could have day-to-day connections, cross-government themed groups, multi-stakeholder advisory groups, all sorts of things. There are all sorts of ways you could do it. But really what you need to make this work is a clear strategy or set of policy priorities that would incentivize greater collaboration. As I mentioned earlier, if you have different departments with different goals, then it's actually very difficult to create this kind of coordination. And in fact, you may not even be rewarded for it, depending on what your KPIs are within your certain department or what the actual departmental aims are. So there's things that people can do, but there are other factors that also need to be considered. This is a tool that I've been working on. So this is going to get launched in a couple of weeks. So this is a tool which has gathered together about, I think it's, I just did a count earlier, it was about 56 policies across federal government. You could do this with any set of legislation or policy for any system, but this one's based on federal government policy. And what we've done is we've created and we've tested it against, how do I explain it? We've analysed it against two ontologies. One was by the high level panel of experts, and another one was based on the Wageningen Van Berkom model for defining policy activities and policy outcomes. And what this allows you to do is essentially, I use the word kind of butterfly net. You can grab a bunch of policies relevant to your area very quickly just by interacting with the tool. So the idea is that if you've got a particular interest between an interaction within the food system or a particular area, particular region or target population, you should be able to filter very quickly, and then you'll be able to grab a list of policies relevant to that area. So this is one way of visibilizing policies across government portfolios. So it cuts right across, and then people can see what other people are doing. And that means that even without that coordination we were talking about earlier, people can still see how what they're doing interacts with other policies. And the idea of this tool was to be a stepping stone towards talking about policy coherence. So here are some other kind of ways of thinking about food systems and food system dynamics. So this one with the drivers and activities and outcomes in the corner is typical of the models I was showing earlier of what how people understand what food systems are. This one with the A's, B's, and C's, and D's, and pluses and minuses is a representation of a causal loop diagram. These are very popular with lots of food system scholars to try and kind of illustrate how different parts of the food system interact. And one thing that my team in working between University of Queensland and CSIRO has been this network analysis of food systems. Now, the drawback of network analysis is that it doesn't give you the nuance. It's obviously positivistic in nature, but what it does allow you to do is take lots and lots of different variables and potentially shake out certain types of interactions, either expected or unexpected. And so from these interactions, we found some very, very interesting things coming out about the relationship of work and obesity and things like that. So that's currently in press. That should be out soon. And this is these insanely complex diagrams here based on different time periods. So it's a sort of obvious one, but it's a GIS mapping. So I've just pinched this from a piece of work I'm doing where I'm trying to do some analysis of food environments in Brisbane. And these dots represent different forms of different categories of food retail. And the idea of this work is it allows us to visualize multiple data sets in geographical space. So what I've actually done, I haven't shown it here, is provide an overlay of socioeconomic areas, and then you can compare how different forms of food availability and food access based on and with what's with socioeconomic status. And not surprisingly, you get greater availability of more kind of fresh food and more diversity in areas which are slightly wealthier, and you get things either less availability, full stop, or more like food swamps. In slightly poorer areas. So it's not exactly a surprise, but there's a lot of power in being able to visualize it, and it's very useful for targeting policy intervention. So if you can see it, you can do something about it. And this is a riff on when I used to work for the Office of National Statistics here, which is better statistics, better decisions, better data, better decisions. If you can see it, so you can do something about it. So this is something I've pinched from one of my colleagues, Andy Hall, who's an expert in policy innovation, agri-food system innovation. And he's really interested in this idea of bottom up and top down. And so I guess through various things I've been saying in this talk, that we can kind of talk about the value of using big data, but that we also need to be thinking about we also can't assume too much, and we need to be thinking about more qualitative understandings at the bottom in order to have this reflexive relationship and constantly be testing our assumptions in order to make sure we're making the right interventions and that we can actually see what the problems are. So it's hard to do because it's quite labor intensive, but it means that we can continue to understand new problems as they evolve, and if necessary, then produce new forms of measurement that allows us to also view things from the top or at scale, but with the idea that we're continuously testing. So I borrowed this from him. And then there are some kind of ways that we can kind of conceptualize food system transformation over time. I'm not sure how useful this is, but this is a diagram I made quite a while ago, which was food systems with the kind of uncertainty. The idea is to try and help people conceptualize what food system transformation is like. So the idea is there's lots of different outcomes, and that interactions will change over time. I can come back to that if people have questions about that. I would shoot through the remaining ones. There's the three horizons model, which talks about the idea of the current state, desired state, which is the green line, and then the intermediate state of innovations, that is the kind of disruption that occurs between. And the idea is to think about, if you want to actually make a transformation, you need to understand that there are these different phases that need to be moved through. And that can help people understand how to manage the uncertainty of the process. And I think that that's certainly an obstacle. I probably should have put this in challenges for making changes within food system, for actually having policy options, because actually these intermediate phases of uncertainty can lead to people being too risk averse to actually make the changes that are required. If that makes sense. Again, I can return to that if anyone has any questions. So another way of thinking about food system issues is, depending on what you're doing, that you have kind of spheres of concern, things you can control, things you can influence, and things that you can be concerned about. So there are things we can't change. There are certain external geopolitical factors, environmental effects that can have massive impact on us, but we can't control. But there are other things that we can influence and control, and it's really trying to understand these, which allows us to approach policy in a more kind of realistic way, without becoming sort of overwhelmed or demoralized by the kind of wicked problem that it faces. Is if you can start with what you actually can control, you can start to do even incremental things which will make things better. I like this idea of a mosaic, that food systems are so complicated that we shouldn't expect to always see everything, and that we should actually embrace gaps in our knowledge. We should actually expect to see that we won't be able to see everything, but actually when we put lots of different disparate pieces of information together across lots of different disciplines, we might be able to actually make sense of it later, or that we should actually be able to embrace these gaps as areas that we need to actually research. And then I think we're getting to the end now. The idea of the food system as a boundary object, that there are going to be, as I was discussing earlier, lots of different groups having lots of different perspectives, but actually through coordination systems, we can come to common understandings across different disciplines, across different departments, that allows us to find a common understanding and common goals. And so it's using these food systems as a boundary object, which can actually foster these sort of interdepartmental, interdisciplinary, or multi-perspective understandings of food systems. And so to conclude, so what we've discussed, I'm just going to do a recap. We've discussed how the purpose of a system is what it does, and the evidence and argument for food system transformation. We've talked about the complex and fragmented nature of policy, which is a challenge for governments and researchers to clearly see all food system policies. I discussed how paradigms was explored as an approach to promote clear sighted views of institutional and national thinking. Although I'd say actually my results from that are slightly complicated. And I've given some tools and concepts that enable better cross-comparison and coverage of food system policy, food system data, and the theories of change that could help begin to tackle some wicked problems. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Jeremy. I saw many people taking lots of photos throughout this, so I think we've all want to go back to different little bits, but thank you for that. It was a really interesting talk. I'm just going to bring up the question and answer panel here. We've got 9 things in the chat, 10 things in the chat, lots of people saying brilliant, thank you, really interesting. I will go to the Q&A though, so do please. There's only one in the Q&A. So before I go to the Q&A question, I'll also be seeing if there's people in the room. But for now, as we are the Centre for Food Policy, and there might be policymakers listening, there might be policymakers in the audience, what are your key takeaways from your talk in regards to what do policymakers, be it at local, national, global level, need to take away from your talk? What are the top 3 things they need to walk away with?
I'll see if I can come up with 3. Okay.
Actions they need to start with. Maybe that.
I suppose what I was trying to do is I was trying to show one, that we need to combine bottom up and top down approaches in order to continually test our food systems. That we can't rely on headline statistics that as a kind of center of truth for whether we're experiencing issues within the food system. I think that's really, really important. I think that the other idea is conceptualizing food system change, particularly the idea of the boundary object, but these other ways of connecting systems, the idea of networks, as a way to bring different information together across different disciplines to allow us to see different aspects of the food system. And I think that's very important for government, for policymakers. So there are areas maybe outside of a department's expertise or outside of their portfolio, outside of their area of control, that actually they should be able to see and attend to, or at least understand who they should be speaking to, in terms of building a policy that actually brings together multiple parts of the food system. And then the other part was to show that there are lots of different coordination mechanisms possible and lots of things that we can use, like a small bit of investment in, say, developing a policy analysis tool can save a lot of people time, which means that people can really build on that. And hopefully, again, it's this idea of being able to actually just see what's in front of them and make better decisions. So I think I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Okay, that's some good summaries there. I'll go to people in the room. Shall we just first go with this question? Oh, there's more than one Q&A in the chat now. Okay, people are asking where they can access the tool. Do you want to just give a brief shout out to the tool? It's coming online soon.
Yes, so I believe the tool is going to be, so if you follow, I'm trying to think how to.
Well, if you tell us when, we can send out to everybody who registered.
Yes.
When the tool is going to be.
Yeah, so the tool is going to be launched, I believe, on the 27th of October. So it'll be available and you'll be able to search it online. If you look up CSIRO.
CSIRO.
Yes, sorry.
Which for those not in Australia who slur their words.
Yeah, that's right. And if you look at policy tool food, you'll find it. So that should be that will be released in 2 months. Yeah, no, sorry, in 2 weeks, I think.
Okay, so do you mind if I do these two and then we can go to the room?
Absolutely,
as well? Yeah. Okay, so Alan Whiteside is asking, what about a system of systems? People are going to prioritize their family over environment when in food poverty.
Absolutely.
How does this work? You've just said absolutely. Do you want to reflect a bit further on that in terms of what does this mean for your analysis of food systems in terms of different priorities?
That's right. So I mean, this is part of the thing about what we can see and where the issues lie. For example, a piece of research I was doing recently was looking at the affordability of food in Australia. And it turned out that while the supermarkets have been a major target of sort of ire of people in this cost of living crisis, actually, one of the things that was affecting people most was rent. And it was rent that was eating away at people's discretionary income, which meant that they were experiencing food stress. And we're defining food stress here as about 25 to 30% of your disposable income, like after you've paid all your bills, going towards food. So it's at this point when people experience any kind of concern. So it could be a health scare, it could be a broken down car, any kind of surprise thing can completely rock your budget. And then you're feeling this sense of food stress. And this is where governments need to be able to see how these issues connect so they can actually decide what interventions are actually going to have the greatest impact, so that you can actually say, okay, well, why is a family experiencing food poverty, and what are the drivers of that? And if we can start to unpick that, then absolutely, then we can kind of start to think about what these other problems are. And I mean, what I'd say is, in a way, I think it's a great question, but I would say actually all of these things are connected. In the long run, you can't actually ignore environment if you want to have long-term food security. You just can't. But it's a very important question for right now. Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah.
If there are questions in the room, please do raise your hands. I'm going to keep going. We've got two in the room. Let's go to the two in the room and then come back online. Does that work for you?
That's perfect.
Okay. Do you want to identify yourself as you ask questions? Do you want to go first?
Sure. Hi. Thank you for that lovely talk. Very insightful. My name is Karan Shingal. I'm working with Felix Project. It's a charity on food distribution. My question was more around, you talked about how there was this shift to multifunctionalism due to the climate agenda being the top headline right now. In your research, what did you see as the main catalysts or the causes of shift or movement in paradigms across the 7-8 countries that you analyzed? What I'm trying to ask is, what are the most impactful levers of change that cause the paradigms to shift, so we can possibly identify those levers to catalyze the shifts you want?
Yes, so that was really interesting. So if you look early on, there are some very clear reasons why paradigm shifts. So world wars create a massive paradigm shift, right? As soon as there's so if you look at World War I, World War II, certainly in Britain, lots of food was coming in by boat, and so what happened is that after World War II, Britain's capacity for feeding itself went up to. It gradually rose and rose and rose up until the early 1980s. I think we got to about 70% feeding ourselves, which is amazing when you consider now. So there was this actual massive push to create internal food security because of the memory of war and the memory of shortage. And so war was a major one. And war could well be won again, just, worth thinking about. But actually, there was quite a lot of difference across these different countries. So Norway has a lot of focus on its allodial system, which means its culture of families owning farms. And they've had a whole century of policy focused on keeping people living on their farms or owning their farms, which is kind of combined with regional development, which has led to a form of politics where you have a very, very strong farmers' party in Norway. Interestingly, you have similar dynamics appearing in the United States, where the central states, where everyone farms, the red states, also there's strong support systems from the American government supporting these farmers until maybe last week, which meant that people that there's actually quite a lot of people held in their farms because that's how the politics have shaken out. So there's interest. There's different things, different places. One of the things for Europe is that because of this massive move to mechanization from the Second World War onwards, and this kind of promotion of kind of internal food security, what happened is that there was lots of environmental degradation, which by the 80s was absolutely apparent. And so that's when this idea of multifunctionality and the topic of sustainability starts to become mainstreamed in international fora. And so you can start to see these shifts happening where the European Union says, right, we're actually going to make farmers who receive CAP start to do things which can kind of ameliorate some of these problems.
Great, thank you. That was really interesting. I wish I'd brought up your diagram for the last couple of to answer to that question. Would you like to identify and ask your question?
Laura Lane from Food Policy here, doing a PhD. My question was really similar. I wanted to say that I thought that your 4 quadrants was a fascinating way of conceptualizing all of this, and wanted to ask you whether you, reflecting on the kind of political instability in many of your case studies, like a paradigm shift in the way that are looking, but specifically you mentioned war, so what might that look like?
Well, what you would expect, yes, thank you. So what you would expect is war, something like a war, to move people to a kind of exceptionalist, productivist paradigm. So you'd say war would mean you produce as much as you can to have food security, and the state will pay whatever it takes to do it. It's not going to be a free market, probably not, right? So that's what you expect, and that was the kind of very much the kind of pre-mercantilist feudal society. Was everyone was producing their own food and putting tariffs on everything. And in fact, the repeal of the Corn Laws, which was sort of this kind of boring, echoing thing that you have when you're doing education in the UK in secondary school, actually now I understand is probably the most interesting event in the last 200 years, because it was the first time there was a kind of global food regime where you had completely free trade, and it led to lots of interesting historical things, which I think is another talk, to be honest.
You don't learn about it in Australia, I'll just say.
What about the
Corn Laws? We didn't learn about it at all.
Really?
Yeah, but again, just interesting in terms of regime.
Fascinating.
But thank you for that. And again, really interesting diagram. I was wondering where the kind of Anthropocene / modern third food regime fits into your diagram as well. But again, you kind of zag it through. Shall we go back to the online question and answer online, and then we can go back to room? So how about we go for Mary Rose's question? In fact, they've now got 2 following on from each other. So Mary Rose says, hi, does the space between top down and bottom up have a name? The skill set, institutional capacity that seems to be in shorter supply from my perspective is in the in-between, the policy implementation piece, the bit where the policy meets the operations, how the higher ups understand how to get the lower downs to do what's necessarily. I guess what I'm trying to ask is about how we frame the how of policy as much as the what.
So I think that's a brilliant question. And I'm trying to think, and I think the best answer to that is actually food systems researchers. So I think it's actually the capacity building of food systems researchers, people with interdisciplinary skill sets, people with an understanding of all these diverse issues and who can actually make sense of them, that is the in-between. These are the people who will be the interface between, who can do qualitative research on the ground, have an understanding and of how policymakers work, and then act as the kind of communication piece between the two. I think that's the only way it's going to work. But I don't have a name for it, and I should find out.
So the job for you now is to create a name for this action and this.
Or ask my colleague, because there might well be a very technical term for it, which I don't know.
Okay. So we have an anonymous attendee asking, do you think we should increase other ontological and epistemological approaches beyond the positivist in food system research as a way of bottom-up data gathering?
Yes.
Or data gathering?
100%. And I think I apologise if I didn't emphasise that enough in my talk. I'm absolutely saying we need to be doing qualitative research all the time as a way of stress testing our ontologies for positivist research. But also, we should also be thinking about, and this is obviously very much based on my my other life as an anthropologist and working in Australia, where we have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. There are different ways of knowing, different ways of thinking. There are different systems of knowledge that need to be understood and respected, and need to be engaged with on their own terms, not fused into a kind of government science, but actually understood in their own terms that can actually lead to different forms of outcomes. And that again means that you won't be able to manage everything with a headline statistic. That means you will need to be engaging with people at these different scales. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. We've got some. Let's go back to the room. We've got two in the room, and then we'll go back online. 1 second as I unmute.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. Nigel Jeffrey from the Policy Institute at King's College London. I'm interested in the food systems transition to plant-rich diets, and in particular the gap between numerous eminent organisations advocating such a transition and a lack of uptake by UK politicians.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that gap?
So I'm not an expert on UK policy. I do follow the news living in Australia, so I can only speak to kind of the kind of cursory things I hear. But I think it's a question of political economy. So I think that where meat production, for example, is going to have a higher return than other forms of farming, and there's no other support for a farmer, they will follow meat production. So if you want a change to happen, then you need to understand what the drivers of the farmer are. If they're commercially driven, then that will be what it is. If it was very, very lucrative to suddenly grow a plant,
Beans and peas.
Peas, yeah, any legumes. If it's to switch to horticulture, you'll find people will do it. The issue right now, I think, and this is a kind of almost a global issue, is loads of farmers live in debt, and so they are mainly focused on servicing their debts and trying to make as much money as possible. Which means that a bit like that question earlier, asking about, well, what if people's families are hungry? For a farmer who's just trying to make ends meet, they're not going to be as concerned around, well, I should switch to chickpeas because it's better for the environment. I think that's the obstacle we face. That's the major barrier. So we need to create some form of incentives, or that's my opinion. Otherwise, we're waiting for the market. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, there was a question over here.
Hi, Anthony So. I'm a policy consultant at the Centre for Food Policy. Again, in that previous slide with the quadrant, I noticed the top right part sort of really empty.
There is a notable gap in terms of free market multifunctionality.
You mentioned there that France, Ireland, the EU is sort of shifting. Is that right quadrant quite empty because it hasn't been tried, or is multifunctionality and the free market, are they incompatible?
No, they are compatible, but at the moment, the way they exist is, I wish I'd used another slide actually, because I had another slide from a different presentation which probably shows this more clearly. It exists in patches. So if you go on a tour of the wine country in France, you will find there are absolutely free market multifunctionality in a way operating there, because they've got high value product, they're making lots of money, they can put you up in a nice villa or hotel, and that there might be lots of things they're attending to. So, for example, it's actually embedded into the kind of early EU constitution, which is keeping people on the land, the cultural landscape of Europe, that European people are farming people. As you can read it, it's really fascinating if you look at the kind of foundation of Europe kind of constitution. And in Australia, there's the Sunshine Coast. Again, really nice place to visit, lots of tourism. It can support these other values. And one of the things people are talking about at the moment is, in terms of farming, the future is in values. It's in biodiversity, it might be in doing nice things, it might be a sticker on the front with a green frog on it, all sorts of things which promote these other things which can add value to the product they're selling, which will work on the free market. But actually, it's very minimal. It's really like piecemeal. But one of the things that is driving people towards this is financialization. Now, financialization is an interesting question because it can be kind of controversial. There's issues of greenwashing. There's issues of how you define things like biodiversity credits, how you define the effectiveness of a, say, carbon trading scheme. But things like ESG and financialization are the things which are potentially creating a convergence of all of these countries into this kind of free market multifunctionality space. And so it could be an extremely disruptive, in the kind of technology sense, kind of instrument or technology that that changes the kind of paradigm, but it will change it in a very specific way.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I now kind of feel I want to go back to your previous. So I'm driving now. Sorry. Where's your looking at that in terms of financialization and corporate capture within in these different countries as a mechanism would be, and adoption of different technologies would go to that. Let's go back to the questions online. Sorry, digressing. So we've done Mary Rose's one there on the implementation gap. Answer done. So Jeff Tansey, it's lovely to hear from you, Jeff. Hopefully you're doing well. Jeff Tansey is highlighting Friedman and McMichael argue that food systems emerge from a food regimes which relate to state power and the political economy, shifting hegemonic power, so perhaps need to see food systems more as a subsystem of a larger system. I've just put the link for the following conversation with Harriet Friedman on food regime states and transformational change. I think he means he's put that into the chat for those online. I'll try and share that as a link afterward. I'm guessing that's on your amazing website, Jeff, that you've put that as a link. Do you want to respond to that?
So let me understand. So it's sort of food systems as sort of
a subsystem of a bigger system.
As a subsystem of a bigger system,
which is the regime itself.
Yes, I believe so. I mean, I totally agree. I mean, I think that the way we should understand the food system is in the context of a kind of global capitalism, you know, and I don't think we can separate those two things. The political economy that enables global capitalism is what maintains it. Although what I've actually tried to show in this is how much different countries, despite global capitalism, still go their own way. And I think that we can point to various instances recently. The Arab Spring is a very kind of famous example that people use, is that when food insecurity goes past a certain inflection point, that you can actually have massive breakdown of society very rapidly. So one of the things with the Arab Spring was it was related to a wheat failure in Russia. So wheat failure in Russia, not in Northern Africa, meant a big spike in wheat prices, which meant the price of bread went up, and that was actually the turning point, which led to a lot of civil unrest and obviously what unfolded from there. That you do see some states starting to think about, well, actually, where food is the foundation of kind of order that they decide, and we're talking about this again with war and productivism and exceptionalism, they will prioritize food if it means avoiding other forms of disruption. So they will, yeah. So it's a complex question. I kind of think it's both. If that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, great. Thank you very much for that. We've run out of questions in the Q&A box. I encourage you to put more in. We've got a few more questions in the room, but please, if you're online, do put your questions into the Q&A. It's lovely having them. We have two. Whoa, we've got four now, maybe. Okay, shall we take them one at a time? So,
I had a question about one of your other diagrams, which was the one with the H1, H2, H3.
Oh, yes.
And you spoke about, so there one line, I believe, was like what you, yeah, so where you were currently going, what your the desired, and then the other one was the sort of intermediate.
You've not done our political economy of food module yet, yeah.
I guess, and you said that one of them, one of the intermediate processes can, it can turn people off, so then you don't end up in your desired state.
Yeah.
I wonder whether you could talk about any examples of that, and sort of whether there's been examples of that, and whether there's been like successfully avoided. Do you know what I mean? Like it's been sort of noticed as it happened, and then it's been successfully diverted.
I mean, I think that we're kind of going through this at the moment, which is we went through a period of talking about sustainability getting mainstreamed during the 1980s and 1990s. Some of those who are a bit older, all of the cartoons in the 1990s had all of these green values embedded into them. Now, no longer. And that we've seen this kind of rapprochement in terms of sustainability generally. And so that's what I think is going on. I think that we're currently in this kind of H2 phase, the Horizon 2, where we're struggling to actually make a more sustainable system happen. I think things are being done, but as you can see, if you look to policy, not just in America, but here right now, in terms of planning policy, there's lots of things being done which are really not very good for sustainability and probably not very good for food. Sorry, that's my opinion in the Australian government. But no, it's not, I don't represent them. So it's, I think that we're living in that tension right now. It's that that kind of idea of ignoring climate change, even though it was kind of established 30, 40 years ago. But that at the same time, while there's a push back against it, there's still we still have COP, we still have ESG, we still have multiple movements which are saying, no, we do need to do something. So that's that conflict where we're kind of, we're living in that kind of contradiction right now, I think. Does that make sense?
Okay, great question there. What was another one up the back?
Jess, also a researcher at the Centre for Food Policy. I picked up and kind of made a note of what you said about there's intermediate phases of uncertainty, which can lead to people being too risk averse.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could go into that in a bit more detail, maybe with some case studies.
I can't think of a case study off the top of my head. I suppose the way I sort of came to that idea is that if you look across certainly Australian policy and probably policy in the UK, there are lots of policy documents which set out exactly what lots of experts believe should happen. There's lots of great people who work for the Australian government. There's lots of researchers who feed into these policy documents. And they set out a perfect strategy which says we want to aim to do this. But when it comes to doing it, it's going to, so I suppose this is my case study really, these things will upset certain vested interests because the political economy exists as it does now, and politicians may balk at upsetting vested interests. They're receiving a donation from, for example, the meat industry. So Beef Week is one of the most important political events in the calendar in Australia. Then they may not decide to do something which harms the beef industry, despite there being, say, lots of evidence that we should probably rethink how we manage beef, how we manage cattle herds. So that's an example where that kind of reticence from politicians to act is the example of that idea of risk averseness, which is kind of holding us back from moving forward, I think.
Right, other questions? We've got one there, one there. Shall we just keep going down the room, as it were?
Yeah, thanks again, Max. I'm one of the master's students here at the Centre. I just wanted to ask about one of the other diagrams. Was you mentioned that you could say more about the cone of uncertainty, because I wanted to see like how that could make it through.
I went the wrong way in the slide deck, everybody. I'll be right back with you.
The cone of uncertainty. So how that came about, that is two diagrams that I smooshed together. So the cone of uncertainty is used by this economist gave it to me as this idea of how actually lots of people who work in the Department of Defense think about the future. So they say over time, the cone represents the increasing number of possibilities that can exist. So right now we live in the singularity, right? It's kind of Star Trek language. We live in the singularity, we live in what exists now, and over time there are going to be increasing forms of potential things that can happen. And that within all these things that can happen, you know, we can say there's lots of different things that are going to influence where we end up. And the idea is that you want to take into account all of those uncertainties that can affect you. And that what we want, that you have to think, what changes do we need to make to not go in a straight line if that's not where we want to be? So if you just want continuity, what's that going to mean? And how are you going to be kind of affected by the other parameters? But then if you actually want to have something different, this desirable future, then you have to think, well, actually, that's the idea of transformation. That's where you actually need to do something that actually kind of changes things enough that you actually are on a different trajectory. And it kind of falls into these discussions we have about overshoot and kind of staying within 2 degrees, which used to be 1.5 degrees, by the way. You know, is that we're on a certain pathway. What do we need to do to avoid that pathway? And what we've done is we've just moved the baseline, unfortunately. So that would be a good example of that.
Following on from that, we have a really interesting question online. So this is talking about your outcome dependency slide, which I'm thinking is back in the deck, correct? That one, yeah. So Mary Rose is highlighting, thank you again, this is brilliant. On the comparative outcomes slide, the UK seems to be an outlier with a negative trade dependency 2004 to 21. Does that reflect Brexit changes, i.e. 17 to 21, more than the whole series? Wondering if the TFP convergence, regardless of the paradigm, the policy paradigm, may be an artifact of this sort of quantification method itself.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely issues with TFP, and so I have had some kind of wry comments from a evolutionary economist who was like, well, what does that even mean? So, I mean, I think it's interesting that they all converge, and that if that's a measure that people are using, but in a way, I guess I'm breaking my own rule because I was saying you shouldn't use headline statistics, and I just used one to make a point. But it is interesting that despite there being these divergences, that everything comes together. But what was the it was the I'm trying to see what was the specific question?
It was just around the UK and Brexit. So the green arrow here, just going down since 2017. So Brexit bringing us out, but also I'm guessing what they were highlighting was just the UK's policy has changed slightly compared to the others.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it's that I think we need to look at lots of different factors because actually, Britain was still in the EU until 2020.
Yeah.
2? Yeah.
2020.
Okay,
yeah.
so it's still there until 2020. So it doesn't quite explain those things unless there was some issues with uncertainty. I don't know. It would have to. Yeah, I mean, it'd be kind of interesting to dig up what was affecting, because it could have even just been bad weather. You know, that's the thing about these things. It could be a couple of years of bad weather.
Changes production.
Change the whole thing. Yeah, exactly. So
okay, Chester has a question, I believe. Yep.
Chester Tuari, I'm I guess food systems and health inequalities consultant. I had a question about, so you mentioned about ESG. I'm curious about the increase or the increasing likelihood that there's going to be scope 3 or indirect emissions being mandatory for communication. I think that's happening in Australia as well as in the UK and across Europe and other places too. So do you see that as being something that might actually force some kind of transition, or do you think there's going to be a lot of problem with data and it's not going to really take us anywhere?
I mean, this is the question I keep having, is whether it's actually how we'd only have to look at the outcomes to see how realistic it is, to say actually whether it will have an effect. What it's going to do is it's definitely going to put more pressure on farmers to do things in a certain way, but then it's going to depend on how you're going to calculate it. And I think that's what it's going to come down to, is how are these things being calculated, and what are the penalties? So at the moment, it may be that it's negligible to be a kind of highly carbon emitting farm in terms of the scope 3. So I don't actually know yet how it's going to translate through when once a say a large supermarket takes into account its farming systems. So I think that's a really good question, and that's what I've been thinking about as well. It's like, how is this actually going to be implemented? What does it mean? And we don't know yet, and that's why I'm a bit uncertain about it and slightly skeptical, because until someone says, well, what are the brass tacks that actually hold this thing together, then we don't really know if it's meaningful or not. But I mean, it feels like it's the right direction to actually say, at least we're counting it, at least we're thinking about it, at least there's a framework in place which can be improved rather than nothing. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Any final questions? Just holding space. No, well, thank you very much online. It was an amazingly robust discussion. You've held us and answered our questions for quite a while. So thank you for joining us online. Thank you for joining us in the room. Shall we just give a final round of applause? And hopefully see you all online for the Food Thinkers coming up on the 22nd of October. Please do register for that. See you guys at another in-person or online Centre for Food Policy event another time. Good evening. Oh, we just get another question. No, thank you. Thank you, Susan. Okay, I will stop the recording. How do I do that?